Some women drift through a man's life like wind through tall grass, felt but never held. Others pass like rain, refreshing but fleeting, leaving behind the memory of something soft, something necessary. But once in a while, a woman arrives, who never fully enters his world, and yet she alters it forever. She doesn't need to chase, prove, or perform. She exists beyond reach, not because she's arrogant, but because she's awake. He feels her before he understands her. She becomes his most beautiful confusion. He didn't know what it was about her at first. Maybe it was the stillness in her voice or the way her eyes didn't search for approval. She didn't need anything from him. And that, more than her. Beauty, more than her wit, was the beginning of his undoing. Because most women orbit men's expectations, bending themselves into shapes that feel familiar, comfortable, compliant. But she walked like she answered to a different law. She didn't adapt to his presence. She simply existed beside him, whole and unshaken, as if his validation meant absolutely nothing. You see? When a man meets a woman who is truly awake, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, he senses it before he can define it. Her energy doesn't beg to be seen. It commands without effort. Her silence says more than her words, and her absence stings louder than another woman's constant noise. This isn't the kind of woman he can win with charm or possession. She sees through masks, through sweet words, through rehearsed masculinity. She doesn't respond to performance. She watches for essence. He tried, in his quiet way, to pull her in. With glances, with small jokes, with subtle touches of attention. And she smiled, kind but distant. She didn't need saving. She wasn't playing hard to get. She was just not for sale. And this was the paradox that made him ache. Because the moment a man cannot conquer a woman, something ancient within him awakens. Not the predator, no, the dreamer. He begins to see her as myth, as symbol, as everything he has ever longed for but never deserved. He had known women who offered themselves quickly, who needed him to make them feel enough. But she didn't need to be made to feel anything. She was already enough, and it radiated from her like sunlight from the sea. Quiet, endless, unbothered. She didn't perform her value. She embodied it. And it terrified him more than he could explain, because deep down he knew that the parts of him that wanted to possess her were the same parts she had. Outgrown long ago, she didn't crave intimacy out of loneliness. She had already faced the abyss alone. She had held her own. Pain bled from it, healed through it. Her wisdom wasn't a badge. It was a scar turned sacred. He couldn't offer her illusions. He couldn't impress her with things that once worked on others. She didn't care about what he had. She wanted to know what he hid. And that, more than anything, made him retreat. You see, men often fantasize about a goddess until they meet one. And then, when they do, they either rise into their masculinity to meet her, or they flee, ashamed of their smallness. She became the mirror he avoided, the one who reflected his unhealed wounds, not with cruelty, but with clarity. And clarity is rarely comfortable. At night, he would think of her, not with lust, not with longing alone, but with that hollow ache that comes when you know something slipped through your fingers, not because it disappeared, but because you never learned how to hold it. He replayed moments. The way she smiled. At silence, the way she walked away without looking back. The way her absence didn't scream, it echoed. She didn't block him. She didn't beg him. She simply withdrew, like the moon retreating into daylight. And what haunted him most was that she didn't hate him. She simply outgrew needing to be understood by someone who hadn't done the inner work to understand himself. She wasn't punishing him. She wasn't trying to teach him a lesson. She was just ... gone. And in that departure, She became more present in his mind than any woman who had ever stayed. He began to understand that he hadn't lost her. He had never really had her to begin with. She wasn't something to have. She was someone to meet fully, wholly, bravely. And he hadn't met her. Not really. He had only met his idea of her, and by the time he saw her truth, she had already become the dream he couldn't reach. Because some women don't break your heart, they awaken your soul. And if you're not ready, if your ego is still louder than your spirit, you won't rise. You'll shrink. You'll rationalize. You'll let her go and call it fate, timing, bad luck. But deep down, in the most honest part of yourself, you'll know it wasn't any of those things. It was you. You weren't ready for her. Not because she was too much, but because you were still too little. She didn't want perfection. She wanted presence. Not a man who could promise the world, but a man who had wrestled with his own shadows and emerged conscious. A man who could meet her on the soul's ground, not just in the bed, not just in public. She wanted someone real, and he was still playing roles. And so she became the myth he would tell himself when he couldn't sleep. The what if that curled around his thoughts like incense. She became poetry in his silence. Not because she stayed, but because she knew when to leave. And in leaving, she made herself unforgettable. Most men do not know when they are standing in the presence of something sacred and it's gone. The truth is, they mistake the sacred for softness, mistake grace for availability, and confuse the open-hearted woman with a woman who will stay. But she didn't stay. She vanished not with noise, not with fury, but like a prayer withdrawn from the wind. Like a candle snuffed by the very breath that once warmed it. Have you ever wondered why some men seem haunted by the woman they couldn't hold on to? Not the one who begged, not the one who bent her boundaries to please, but the one who walked away without needing to break him. The one who loved without chains, touched without owning, and disappeared without screaming. The one who didn't make him crawl back because she never asked him to follow her in the first place. She became the dream he could never touch. This woman. She was not simply beautiful in the way others admired. She was beautiful in the way ancient things are beautiful, the way ruins echo with meaning, in the way a full moon can make you feel both wild and alone. Her beauty wasn't skin. It was energy. It was presence. She didn't chase validation because she had already met herself in the dark. She knew her shadow. She had danced with her demons under moonlight and survived them. She didn't ask a man to complete her because she had become complete in solitude. And he didn't know what to do with that, you see. Most men aren't taught how to hold mystery. They are taught to conquer, to define, to categorize. But she was not a woman who could be conquered. She was not here to be explained. She existed like a riddle the universe never intended him to solve. She listened in silence, not because she didn't have something to say, but because she knew most people only talk to respond, not to understand. She didn't compete with noise. She dissolved from it. And so, when she loved him, it was quiet but seismic. She didn't beg him to change. She simply saw him as he was and still offered the sanctuary of her presence. That's what scared him, because to be seen like that, to be loved without performance, to be held in the eyes of a woman who has already met her own Sauls too. Face your own inadequacy. And he couldn't face it, so he fumbled her. Dropped her, not because she wasn't everything, but because he wasn't ready to be anything. Not with someone like her. He returned to his games. To the women who flattered his ego, but never challenged his mask. To the conversations that skimmed the surface. To the affection that was transactional, predictable, safe. But in the silence of night, in the pause between his conquests, she returned. Not physically. Not through text or memory. But, like a ghost made of fire and freedom, she became the ache in his chest that had no name. She became the mirror his soul couldn't break. She was no longer a woman. She was a symbol. She was the version of himself he never reached, and that, more than anything, is what he couldn't forget. There was a time he thought he understood what intimacy meant. He believed it lived in kisses, in laughter, in texting good morning. But with her, intimacy became a deeper language, one that bypassed words and stirred something ancient in him. It wasn't about possession. It was about presence. It wasn't about touching her body. It was about being allowed into the sacred stillness of her heart. And he wasn't ready. Not then. Maybe not ever. Because when a man hasn't met himself, a woman like her feels like a storm. Not because she's chaotic, but because her peace exposes the chaos he carries. Her calm wasn't the absence of fire. It was the fire mastered. And that terrified him more than any rage could. She was the kind of woman who knew when to let go without bitterness. She didn't weaponize her absence. She didn't perform sadness. She just left, gently and completely, as if the chapter had already closed itself. And when she did, the air changed. He felt it not in the loss of her words, but in the silence where her energy used to be. He noticed the way mornings didn't quite begin the same, the way songs hit a different way, the way life kept moving, but with a strange hollowness. He tried to replace Herb. How do you replace something you never understood to begin with? He dated women who smiled the right way, laughed at his jokes, told him he was everything. And maybe he believed them for a little while, until, inevitably, the hollowness returned. It's because what she gave him wasn't surface. It was soul, and soul doesn't echo in shallow waters. He remembered how she looked at the world, like every leaf had a story, every stranger a hidden wound, every moment a lesson. She didn't need to speak in philosophy. She was philosophy. She wasn't trying to be seen. She had already seen herself. That kind of presence can't be mimicked, no matter how many masks others wear. He began to unravel slowly. Not visibly, not dramatically, but deeply. His nights grew longer. His distractions thinner. The things that once satisfied him, the parties, the validation, the praise, they all began to rot in his hands. He started asking different questions. Not just, why did she leave? But why couldn't I show up for her? And that's when the truth began to bleed through. He never believed he was enough for a woman like her. He confused her gentleness for permission. He thought her silence meant she didn't notice, but she noticed everything, and still chose to love him. That was the ache he couldn't drown, the unbearable beauty of being loved by someone who saw all his cracks and still stayed. Until he gave her no place to stand. Years might pass, decades even, but the memory of her isn't bound to time. She lives in the pauses of his breath, in the pages of his regrets, in the questions he can't stop asking. She became more than memory, she became myth. Not because she tried to be unforgettable, but because she left as she arrived, quietly, fully, and with the kind of grace most people don't recognize until it's long gone. She became the dream he could never touch, not because she was beyond him, but because he never chose to rise to meet her. And some dreams are only meant to be touched by those who are finally ready to wake up. There came a night when he stood in front of the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. Not because his face had aged or his eyes had dimmed, but because the armor he once wore so confidently had begun to rust from within. He could no longer lie to himself with charm or excuses. The echo of her presence had become louder than the distractions he used to silence it. He began to trace his own patterns, noticing how often he mistook love for control, connection for comfort, and attention for meaning. She had once offered him a mirror, too, but he wasn't ready to look. Now, in her absence, he was forced to see, and what he saw wasn't evil or broken, but deeply unhealed. The boy inside him had been crying for years, and she had heard him before he even knew the sound of his own voice. He started walking through life differently, not to win her back, but to understand why he lost her in the first place. He read books, not to seem intelligent, but to feed a curiosity she once sparked. He sat in silence, not as punishment, but as prayer. He started apologizing not to others, but to the parts of himself he abandoned long before she ever walked away. And in that process, he realized something she had always known. Real love doesn't rescue you from yourself, it invites you to meet yourself. He had mistaken her depth for complexity, her peace for mystery. But she wasn't complicated. He was just unprepared for someone so clear. The world, for all its noise and glitter, no longer tempted him like it once did. The validation he once chased began to taste like stale water. He saw through the illusion that love could be found in conquest or possession. He remembered how she never tried to own him, only to understand him. And he remembered how he confused freedom with detachment, thinking he was strong for withholding, when in fact he was just afraid. Afraid of being seen. Afraid of being held accountable by someone who didn't need him but chose him anyway. The weight of that kind of love had been too heavy then. But now it was the only kind that made sense. He watched friends settle for love that looked good in pictures but felt empty in the quiet. And he couldn't unsee what she had shown him, what it meant to be truly met. So he stayed single, not from bitterness, but from reverence. Because once you've tasted the sacred, the superficial can never satisfy. He wasn't looking for her replica. He knew that would be a disservice to both of them. But he carried her lessons like ancient scripture, gently, humbly, and close to his chest. He didn't speak of her often, not because he forgot, but because some stories are too sacred to share. She had been a chapter and yet, somehow, think the spine of his entire book. And though the world would never see their love on display, though there were no wedding photos or anniversary posts, she remained the most honest mirror he had ever faced. Not because she completed him, but because she challenged him to complete himself. He understood now that love wasn't about holding on, it was about honoring what was given. And she had given him everything without asking for anything in return. Except maybe, just maybe, the courage to be the man she already saw hidden behind his fear, and in some quiet way, he hoped she felt that. Not through words, but through the echo of his healing. Because even though he couldn't touch her anymore, she had touched him forever. The seasons moved without mercy. Spring bled into summer, and even the warmth of sunlight on his skin reminded him of her laughter, gentle, golden, unforced. He sometimes found himself standing in places she would have loved, art galleries with crooked frames, coffee shops that smelled like cinnamon and memory, hiking trails where silence spoke louder than words. He imagined her there, not beside him, but within him, her essence stitched into the fabric of his transformation. She was no longer a name in his phone. She was the reason he no longer rushed through life, the reason he paused to listen, to feel, to stay present. And though he would never call her again, every meaningful decision still whispered her name. There was a woman once sweet, kind, curious about him. But as they sat across the table, sipping wine and exchanging surface-level thoughts, he realized something painfully clear. This woman deserved all of him, just as she once did. And he had none of himself left to give, not yet, because his heart had not returned from that chapter. Not out of obsession, but reverence. The kind of reverence that comes when you've loved someone not for who they were to you, but for what they awoke in you. And this new woman, lovely as she was, would never be served scraps. He wouldn't repeat the cycle. So gently, he ended it before it could become a lie. Some nights, when the world grew quiet and his inner voice grew loud, he wondered if she ever thought of him too. If she ever walked through a bookstore and saw a title that reminded her of the conversations they once had, if her fingers ever hovered over his name in her phone before locking the screen again. He didn't wish to return to her life, not as a storm or a regret, but maybe, just maybe, as a soft memory. A lesson she was glad to have lived, even if it came with a scar. He hoped that wherever she was still dancing in moonlight, still writing poetry on napkins, still lighting candles for no reason except to feel warm and real and alive. He began writing letters he would never send. Pages of truth filled with everything he wished he'd had the courage to say when it mattered. "You were never too much," one letter read. "I was just too empty." Another whispered, "You were a cathedral, and I treated you like a hotel." And though no one would ever read them, these letters were sacred. They were confessions, not for forgiveness, but for freedom. Because healing, he realized, isn't always about being understood by the other. Sometimes it's about understanding yourself enough to stop bleeding on people who didn't cut you. And so, the man who once feared depth now sought it in every corner of his life. He built friendships that mirrored her emotional honesty. He carved out space in his life for silence, for softness, for soul. He laughed without performance, cried without shame, and loved without a finish line. And in all of it, every step, every breath, every late-night journal entry, he carried her. Not as a ghost or a regret, but as the sacred reminder that once he was loved by someone who refused to settle for his fragments. She saw the man behind the mask. And though he wasn't ready then, he was becoming him now, for himself, because of her. Asterisk. The years that followed weren't filled with grand triumphs or epic redemptions. They were quieter than that. He didn't write best-selling books or give speeches about growth. Instead, he lived a softer revolution. He became the man who listened, without trying to fix, who stayed in the discomfort of hard truths without running, who no longer chased validation from those who couldn't offer it because he had finally found a home within himself. There were days he still missed Herve. Course there were, but it no longer came with that aching sense of loss. It came like a familiar melody from a song once loved, playing gently in the background of his new life. She, meanwhile, lived out the fullness of her own truth. Somewhere far away, maybe in another city or another chapter, she walked among people who recognized her light and didn't flinch. She had become the muse of her own story, no longer waiting for someone to hold her depth with both hands. The girl who once longed for someone to understand her silence now laughed with those who spoke her language. And though he wasn't there to see it, he imagined her on a rainy afternoon, curled up with a book she loved, utterly at peace. She had given him her heart once not so he could keep it, but so he could learn what a whole one looked like. There were moments when he almost reached out. Birthdays, anniversaries, nights filled with dreams so vivid he could still feel her voice echo in his chest. But something always stopped him. Not fear, not shame, but respect. She had let him go with grace. It was only right that he return the gesture with silence. Because real love, he now understood, isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about stepping aside so both people can become who they're meant to be. If that becoming happens apart, he no longer searched for her reflection in others. She had become more than a person to him. She was a mirror. Moment, a message. She taught him that intimacy isn't in the words you say, but in the truths you're brave enough to share. That a touch isn't what makes something sacred, that's of the vulnerability that precedes it. That love isn't proven by possession, but by presence. And when she walked away, she didn't take his heart. She gave it back to him, just as it was meant to be, open, flawed, and finally beating to the rhythm of something real. And so, the boy who once couldn't hold her became the man who would have never hurt her. Not anymore. Not in this life. Not in this new self he had forged in the fire of her absence. She was the dream he could never touch, yes, but only because she wasn't meant to be held. She was meant to awaken, to burn, to bless. And now, when? He walks through his days with more softness than armor, more truth than tactics. He carries her not in his hands, but in his becoming. Forever the echo that changed everything. Asterisk, in the end, he never told anyone the full story. Not his friends, not even himself in words he could clearly name. But if you watched closely, you could see the quiet legacy she left in him. In the way he looked at strangers with compassion now. In the way he didn't interrupt someone mid-sentence. In the way he paused before reacting, choosing understanding over defense. She had become his silent teacher. And though their chapter closed long ago, her fingerprints remained on every page he wrote afterward. Not in ink, but in who he became when no one was watching. She didn't just walk away, she transformed the air he breathed. People often talk about the ones that got away as if they were mistakes or missed opportunities. But not him. Not anymore. He knew now that some souls don't arrive to stay. Some arrive to stir, to unravel, to show you the map inside your own ribs, the one you never dared to read. She was never his to keep, but she was always his to learn from. She had walked into his life with a love so rare, it demanded evolution. And when he failed to meet it, she didn't punish him. She simply left the door open for him to walk through it someday alone. Better. Truer, he sometimes wondered if she still remembered him. If his name ever surfaced in her quiet thoughts, in between morning coffee and dusk prayers. Elby never hoped for her return. That would have been selfish. Love like hers shouldn't have to repeat itself for someone to finally understand it. No, he didn't wish for another chance. He only wished she was loved now in the way she always deserved. That someone somewhere was asking her the questions he never thought to ask. That someone was holding her hand not just tightly, but tenderly. And if she ever smiled quietly at the memory of them, he hoped it came with peace, not pain. He learned that some endings aren't tragedies. They're beginnings you weren't meant to share. And while he once viewed her departure as a wound, he came to see it as the greatest act of mercy. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she loved herself enough not to shrink. And in doing so, she taught him how to finally love himself too. Not the image, not the projection, but the flawed, fractured man still, worthy of redemption. And maybe that was always her purpose. Not to be touched, but to awaken the parts of him that could finally touch life. And so he let her go. Fully, but never without reverence. She had become the dream he could never touch. Yes, but also the mirror that taught him how to finally see. And that, in the quiet truth of his becoming, was more than enough. Not every love story ends with two people standing side by side. Some end with one person walking away, and the other finally learning how to stand. And if there's a beauty greater than that, he never needed to find it.